Moving into the dark time this year, I want to talk more about what we encounter when we do death work, when we are death walking the unquiet dead to move on to whatever comes next for them. I'm going to be teaching I'm going to be teaching a nuanced perspective on death work. I'm going to be teaching a nuanced perspective on death work on November 7th. If you have interest in that, it's called Weaponizing the Unquiet Dead. You can find information about that on my website. The first thing that I think is really important to communicate for me personally and just generally speaking is that I'm an animist, and that means that my spiritual path is animism. Animism is the awareness that all things have consciousness and that they are in relationship. So it's not an intellectual pursuit, it's not philosophical, it is not a belief. It is the awareness, the experience that everything has consciousness, everything is alive. And within that web of consciousness and relationality, everything has agency. It doesn't all have the same agency, but everything has agency, which means it's all generating impact all the time. So, what I do affects you, what you do affects everybody, and that reinforces the relationality. A thing that is important to understand about animism with regard to death work is we have what we experience as the seen and the unseen. Within seen and unseen, not everything has to have a body and can still generate impact. Animism is, given all of that, an approach to balance, balance throughout nature. And you might call that sacred order. Animism is an awareness and active participation in sacred order. Conceptually, there are some things within particularly modern culture that I think create issues from an animistic standpoint when we have conversations about death walking, and not just conversations about, but those concepts can interfere with the effectiveness of your death walking. When we use words like ghost, haunting, haunted, supernatural, paranormal, all of those words are problematic when we sit with death walking from an animistic perspective. Foremost, when we say the word ghost, most people immediately conjure a specific image or experience. They imagine something spooky, really, really scary, something that immediately pulls strings about whether they accept or deny the plausibility of that happening or that it exists, which means that they also question the bearer of that news, of that experience. So there's already a big question mark on the table that is non-committal to the whole thing. As well, it interjects fear into the equation, and fear creates distance. It takes you out of awareness of oneness with all things so that you can do your job effectively. And kind of the flip side of the fear component, particularly with saying ghost and haunting or haunted, it automatically demonizes whatever the experience was and quite possibly the person who had it. And it absolutely questions their mental and emotional state. Those things are always connected with people saying that they have had an experience of the unseen. When we use words like paranormal, supernatural, when we use those terminologies, we are creating division from the relationality of all things. And so that division is an interference in the relationality of animism, which is not experiencing oneness, which takes you out of the grounding and rooting that you need to do this work. Ultimately, it's not about the terminology. We can call it all chair, like totally uncharged word. It doesn't matter what you're calling it. It's whether you have a trigger response to that wording that affects your ability to do this work in a compassionate and grounded way. And wording absolutely affects your ability to do this work. How you word things triggers your own neurological system, for better or for worse, to say nothing of the people that you might be working with and the beings that you might be working with in the unseen. So, if there are words, phrases that we use that trigger neurological responses, sociological responses, political and interpersonal responses that create division, what words do we use? And I think that that varies largely based on your neurological response. How are you in relationship with those concepts? And how do you want to be in relationship with them? And then there's the here's how I do death work and what might be interfering with that that I need to change. Languaging is a good place to start. So, what words do we use? Probably the wording that I most often use is unquiet dead. And I didn't come up with that phrase. Edith Fiore came up with that phrase back in the 80s, and it describes beings who lived in some variation in form on earth, and at their passing they did not move on for whatever reason. That makes up the biggest population of beings that need to be death walked. There are other populations, and that's a whole other subject. I call them most of the time the unquiet dead because it has no charge. There's no blame for why they're unquiet. There's no specific naming of trauma. There's no designation of them being evil, of demonizing them. It's just acknowledgement that there is a being here who is unquiet and we need to deal with that. The other wording that I will sometimes use is suffering spirits, and that is a phrase that one of my teachers used in the very beginning of my training. And I feel like that one has a charge, but in a good direction because it immediately takes you out of that good and bad polarity and puts you in the center of compassion. And by realizing the whole reason that there's a disruption happening to start with is because something didn't go well for that being. So sit with that a little bit and see what you come up with for yourself. What languaging is appropriate for you? What takes you out of awareness of oneness? And what can you do instead that helps you stay there?